The sheriff's hat hung on the oak like an invitation, its leather sweatband still damp from the morning he'd worn it into Caney Fork Hollow. Someone had driven a railroad spike through the crown, pinning it above a deer femur scraped so clean the marrow hollows caught moonlight like tiny wells. Deputy Frank Coulter found it on October 9, 1937. Carved into the bone in letters precise as engraving were the initials JTM, Sheriff James Thomas McKinney. The search party had gone up 3 days earlier. 14 men with rifles and dogs, following reports of screaming from the old Whitaker place. None came back. The dogs returned alone that first night, whimpering, refusing to turn toward the ridge even when their handlers yanked the leads. The hat and bone were all Frank ever found, and when he tried to pull them down, the spike wouldn't budge. It's still there, rusted now, hidden under 70 years of creeper vine, waiting for anyone fool enough to climb that high. Breathitt County, Kentucky, built itself on coal and violence in equal measure. The hills rose steep enough to hide 100 sins, and the hollows stayed dark even at noon when fog settled thick as wool between the ridges. By 1912, most families had learned to live with their neighbors' secrets, feuds that stretched back to the war between the states, stills tucked into limestone caves, children who looked too much like the preacher or the man who owned the company store. But the Whitakers had always been different. They'd come to Caney Fork in 1873, 5 of them. Elias Whitaker, his wife Constance, and 3 children whose names the county clerk recorded as Mercy, Silas, and John. Elias paid cash for 200 acres on the western slope of Combe Ridge, land so steep you couldn't farm it without tying yourself to a tree. He built a farmhouse from chestnut logs, raised tobacco in the few flat patches, and kept to himself in a way that seemed polite rather than suspicious. Constance came to Jackson once a month for flour and salt. The children attended the one-room school at Bethel for exactly 3 years, then stopped coming. When the teacher asked why, Constance said they'd learned enough. The Whitakers attended the Baptist church on Troublesome Creek until 1907, when something happened during a revival meeting that made the family stand up in the middle of the sermon and walk out. Witnesses remembered Elias pausing at the door, turning back to face the congregation, his eyes catching lamplight in a way that made 3 women in the front pew cross themselves. "You'll know when we're needed again," he said, and that was the last clear sentence anyone heard from a Whitaker for 5 years. After that, they appeared only at dawn. Someone would spot Silas at the post office, buying stamps without speaking, or Mercy at the mill, trading a sack of corn for meal. They moved through town like ghosts on errands, never making eye contact, never answering questions. Children learned not to wave at them. Dogs learned not to bark. And when the Whitakers left town, people found themselves unable to remember exactly what they'd looked like. Just an impression of height, of clothing the color of tree bark, of hands that hung too still at their sides. The last time anyone saw a Whitaker in Jackson was August 14, 1912. Constance came down alone, bought 3 pounds of rock salt and a box of 30-30 cartridges, and walked north toward Caney Fork without a word. The store owner, Hiram Pelfrey, noted it in his ledger. Final purchase, C. Whitaker. Paid in coins so old the mint marks were worn smooth. After that, silence. For the first year, no one noticed the absence. Mountain families often went months without coming to town, especially through winter when the roads turned to mud trenches and creeks rose high enough to sweep away horses. But by 1914, people began to wonder. The tobacco fields on Whitaker land had gone to weeds. The barn roof had caved in, and hunters tracking deer near the property line started reporting things that made them turn around. Laughter, mostly. High and strange, echoing through the trees at dusk when the air went still. Sometimes it sounded like children, sometimes like something trying to imitate children. And there was singing, wordless melodies that followed a hunter for miles, always staying just out of sight, always stopping the moment he aimed his rifle toward the sound. Samuel Greer was the first to go looking. He'd been 16 when the Whitakers stopped coming down, old enough to remember Mercy from school, young enough to carry a torch for a girl he'd barely spoken to. In April of 1915, he told his mother he was going to check on them, make sure they hadn't died of influenza or hunger. She tried to stop him. So did his father. Samuel went anyway, following the old logging road until it petered out into a footpath, then pushing through laurel thickets that grew so dense he had to crawl. He took a rifle, a canteen, and a sack of cornbread. His mother watched from the porch until he crested the first ridge and disappeared into the tree line. 3 days later, his rifle came back. Not Samuel, just the Winchester, propped against the Greer's front gate, its barrel stuffed with black feathers and the stock carved with a message in letters so small you had to squint to read them. He wanted to see. He saw. The sheriff in 1915 was a man named Tom Holbrook, 60 years old and tired of feuds, but he couldn't ignore a missing boy. He took 2 deputies and rode up to Whitaker land on horseback, calling for Samuel, calling for Elias, getting no answer but the wind through dead tobacco stalks. They found the farmhouse still standing, shutters closed, door barred from inside. Holbrook knocked. Something inside knocked back. 3 slow, deliberate thuds that made the horses scream and bolt. The deputies wanted to break the door down. Holbrook said no. He'd fought in Cuba, seen enough strange things to know when to retreat. They rode back to Jackson and filed a report that said Samuel Greer had likely run off to Lexington or Cincinnati, the way young men did when mountain life got too small. His mother knew better, but she stopped asking questions after she found a dead crow on her doorstep every morning for a week. By 1920, Caney Fork Hollow had developed a reputation. Deer hunters avoided it, even though the ridges around Whitaker land held the biggest bucks in the county. Ginseng diggers, who'd normally risk anything for a profitable route, turned back at the property line. And in the churches, preachers started using the hollow as a cautionary tale. What happened when a family turned away from God's grace? When isolation curdled into something darker? But people still heard things. On still nights when the fog settled thick, sounds carried down from the ridge. Footsteps on the old logging road, measured and slow. Axes biting into wood, though no one had harvested timber up there in a decade. And worst of all, voices, not words exactly, but tones of conversation, question and answer, laughter and argument, all of it in registers slightly wrong, like someone tuning a fiddle by ear and missing the right pitch. A revivalist preacher named Josiah Caudle decided in 1926 that the Whitakers needed saving. He was 30 years old, fresh from a tent revival in Hazard, where he'd cast out demons and healed a woman's palsy with prayer and holy water. He announced from his pulpit that he'd go up to Caney Fork alone, spend a night in prayer outside the Whitaker house, and bring that lost family back to the light. His congregation tried to talk him out of it. The older members remembered Tom Holbrook's retreat, remembered Samuel Greer's rifle, but Caudle had conviction and pride in equal measure, and on September 2nd, 1926, he walked up the hollow carrying a Bible, a lantern, and a crucifix carved from Hollywood. He made it farther than anyone expected. A squirrel hunter named Dale Combs saw him that evening, silhouetted against the sunset on the ridge above the hollow, still walking with purpose, still singing hymns loud enough to echo. Dale called out a warning. Caudle waved without turning around. The next morning, his clothes came back. Just the clothes, pants, shirt, vest, all folded neat as Sunday laundry and stacked on the church steps, still warm from body heat, but empty of any body. The Bible was there too, open to Leviticus. Every word on every page burned away except one sentence that repeated across the margins in handwriting that didn't match Caudle's. The land vomits out its inhabitants. The church board voted to seal the Bible in the basement. No one ever opened it again. The Great Depression hit Breathitt County like a hammer. Coal prices collapsed, mines closed, and families that had scraped by for generations found themselves facing starvation. In 1932, the Black Diamond Coal Company started buying up mineral rights across the county, paying cash that desperate men couldn't refuse. They worked their way up every hollow and ridge, mapping seams, drilling test bores, calculating profit margins. In July of 1934, Black Diamond's surveyor, a man named Raymond Voss, reached Caney Fork. His maps showed a potential seam running directly under Whitaker land. High-grade bituminous coal worth thousands, maybe tens of thousands, if the estimates were right. The company hired a lawyer named Albert Newsom to research the property title, find out who owned what, and how much it would cost to buy them out or, if necessary, force a sale through eminent domain. Newsom worked out of a cramped office above Pelfrey's store, surrounded by deed books and survey maps that smelled like mildew and old tobacco. The Whitaker deed was clear enough. 200 acres purchased outright in 1873, taxes paid through 1912, then nothing. No tax payments after that. No recorded deaths. No wills filed. Legally, the property existed in a strange limbo. Abandoned, possibly, but not definitively. Newsom sent letters to the farmhouse. Notice of intent to survey. Notice of tax delinquency. Notice of eminent domain proceedings. None came back unopened. None came back at all. In October, Black Diamond decided to send someone up to serve notice in person. They hired a process server from Hazard, a hard man named Curtis Blevins, who'd repossessed farms and delivered evictions through 2 counties without backing down once. They paid him $50, a fortune in 1934, to walk up to the Whitaker house, nail a legal notice to the door, and walk back with a witness signature that he'd completed service. Blevins took 2 men with him, Raymond Voss, the surveyor, who wanted to see the property firsthand, and a coal company foreman named Ed Lynch, who carried a shotgun and a camera. They left Jackson at dawn on October 7th, 1934. The last person to see them alive was a tobacco farmer named Willis Strong, who watched them disappear into the fog at the mouth of Caney Fork. They should have been back by noon. By sunset, the coal company sent riders to look for them. The riders found boot prints on the logging road, clear enough to follow, leading straight up the hollow toward the ridgeline. The prints stopped at a stream crossing. On the far bank, 3 sets of boot prints came down. Different sizes, older patterns, prints that pressed deeper into the mud as if whoever made them weighed more than any man should. The coal company offered $100 for information, then $200, then $500. No one came forward because no one knew anything except this. The next morning, 3 brass surveying stakes appeared in the churchyard, planted in a perfect triangle, and, hanging from each stake was a surveyor's brass name tag, Voss, Blevins, Lynch, polished to a mirror shine. Not everyone in Jackson had forgotten the Whitakers before they stopped coming to town. There were women, older now, their memories sharpened by years of turning them over like riverstones, who remembered Constance's visits with a clarity that felt less like nostalgia and more like warning. Margaret Holbrook, the former sheriff's widow, told her daughter in 1935 that Constance Whitaker's hands had always bothered her. Not that they were rough or scarred, mountain women all had hands like that, but that they never moved right. When Constance counted change, her fingers flickered too fast to follow. When she reached for a sack of flour, her wrist bent at angles that made Margaret look away, and her nails were always clean, unnaturally so. Even in planting season, when every woman in the county had dirt under hers for months. There was also the matter of the children. Mercy, Silas, and John had attended Bethel School from 1876 to 1879, but the teacher's attendance book showed something strange. An archivist going through county records in 1942 found the ledger and noted in the margins: same 3 names, same 3 ages, 7, 9, 11, recorded every year for 3 years. No aging, possible clerical error. But it wasn't a clerical error. The teacher who kept those records, a woman named Prudence Sloan, had written a letter to her sister in 1878 that survived in a trunk in Hazard. The relevant passage read, "The Whitaker children trouble me. They sit in the back and never speak unless spoken to. They read at a level far beyond their years, or they pretend to read, their eyes moving across pages too quickly to comprehend." I asked Mercy to recite a Bible verse last week. She stood and recited the entire book of Jeremiah without pause, without breath, in a voice that did not sound like her own. When she finished, her brother John laughed, and the sound was so wrong I sent all 3 home early. I will not ask them to recite again. These memories circulated quietly, shared over quilting circles and church suppers, never loud enough to become official record, but persistent enough to shape behavior. When Black Diamond tried to hire local men to go up and clear the property for surveying, no one took the job. When the county proposed building a fire road through Caney Fork to access timber on the far side, the road commission voted it down without explanation. And when Sheriff McKinney started talking in 1937 about forming a search party to finally settle the question of what had happened up there, the women of Jackson told their husbands, brothers, and sons to stay home. Most listened. James Thomas McKinney became sheriff of Breathitt County in January of 1936, elected on a platform of modernization and law enforcement. He was 42, a veteran of the Great War, and he brought with him ideas about how a county should be run. Records kept, crimes investigated, mysteries solved. He'd grown up in Lexington, only moved to Jackson after marrying a local girl, and he didn't carry the weight of old superstitions the way native-born mountain people did. The disappearances bothered him. Not just Voss, Blevins, and Lynch. Those were recent and documented, but the whole history of it. Samuel Greer, Josiah Caudle, Tom Holbrook's strange retreat. McKinney spent months going through records, interviewing anyone who'd lived in Jackson long enough to remember, trying to build a coherent picture of what had happened on Whitaker land since 1912. He compiled a list of confirmed missing persons connected to the property. 9 names spanning 25 years, plus rumors of others who'd gone up and never come back, but whose disappearances had never been officially reported. 9 verified, maybe a dozen more lost to poor record-keeping and families too afraid or ashamed to admit their kin had vanished chasing ghosts. McKinney's theory, which he explained to Deputy Frank Coulter over coffee in March of 1937, was practical. Someone was living on that property, Possibly the Whitakers themselves or squatters who'd moved in after the family died, and they were killing anyone who got too close. Maybe it was moonshiners protecting a still. Maybe it was fugitives hiding from the law. Maybe it was a family of hermits gone feral from isolation. Whatever it was solvable. No mystery, McKinney insisted, survived proper investigation. Frank, who'd been born in Jackson and heard the stories all his life, wasn't so sure. But he was a good deputy, and when McKinney started planning a search party for October, Frank agreed to come along. McKinney recruited 14 men total. He wanted locals who knew the terrain, but he also wanted men who wouldn't spook at shadows. He picked coal miners used to working in the dark, veterans who'd seen combat, hunters comfortable with rifles. He briefed them in the courthouse basement on October 5th, spreading out maps, assigning positions, explaining the plan. They'd go up in daylight, move in a skirmish line to cover maximum ground, and surround the farmhouse before anyone inside could react. If the Whitakers, or whoever was living there, wanted to talk, they'd talk. If they resisted, McKinney had a warrant signed by the circuit judge authorizing entry by force. "This is law enforcement," McKinney told his men. "Not a lynch mob. We go in civilized. We come out with answers." They left at dawn on October 6th, 1937. 14 men and 6 dogs, well-armed, well-provisioned, carrying enough supplies for 3 days if necessary. Wives and mothers watched from porches as the party climbed toward the ridge. Some waved, some just watched, and some, the older women who remembered, closed their curtains and bolted their doors and prayed. Frank Coulter's personal journal, found in his desk after he died in 1968, contains an entry dated October 6th, 1937. The handwriting is hurried but legible. "We made good time to the property line. Sheriff wanted to push through to the house before dark, but the terrain slowed us. Laurel thickets so dense we had to cut our way through. Dogs acting strange, whining, pulling backward. Tom Hensley's hound sat down and wouldn't move. We left it tied to a tree. Found the old logging road around 2 p.m. Clear evidence of use. Recent, too, though how recent I can't say. Boot prints in the mud, but the tread patterns don't match any shoe I've seen. They're deep, like whoever made them weighs 300 pounds, but the stride length is normal. Sheriff says it's probably just erosion making them look odd. We camped at the stream crossing, maybe a mile from the house. Sheriff wanted to move at dawn, surround the place in the morning light. Men nervous but holding together. Cooked salt pork and beans, posted watches, sky clear, stars bright. Just after midnight, we heard singing. High voices, childlike, coming from the ridge above us. Beautiful, in a way that made my skin crawl. Sheriff wanted to investigate. I talked him into waiting for dawn. The singing stopped around 2 a.m., dogs gone when we woke up. All 6 snapped their leads and ran. Found claw marks on the trees where they'd tried to climb. Never seen a dog do that. The journal contains no entry for October 7th. Deputy Frank Coulter came down from Caney Fork alone on October 9th, 1937. Walking into Jackson at dusk with his uniform torn and his hands shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. He went straight to the courthouse, locked himself in McKinney's office, and refused to come out until the circuit judge arrived. What he told the judge, in a statement recorded but never made public, was this. On the morning of October 7th, the search party woke to find their camp disturbed. Not ransacked, disturbed. Their supplies had been moved, rearranged into patterns, rifles stacked in a pyramid, ammunition laid out in concentric circles. Cooking pots nested inside each other with mathematical precision. The fire they'd banked the night before was blazing, fed with wood they hadn't cut. And in the ashes, something was cooking. 3 rabbits, skinned and spitted, roasted to perfection. No one admitted to building up the fire. No one had caught the rabbits. Sheriff McKinney insisted they press on. 7 men agreed. 6 refused, started walking back toward Jackson, and Frank never saw them again. Later investigations found no trace. No bodies, no evidence they'd made it home, just gone. The remaining 8 moved toward the farmhouse. They found it at noon. 2-story log structure, roof partially collapsed, shutters hanging crooked, but fundamentally intact for a building that had supposedly been abandoned for 25 years. The door was open. McKinney called out. No response. He sent 2 men around back, kept the others in a loose perimeter, and approached the front door with Frank at his side. The interior was dim, but not empty. Furniture remained, table, chairs, iron stove, all covered in dust, thick as felt. But on the table sat 14 place settings, clean plates, polished silverware, cloth napkins folded into shapes Frank couldn't name. And at each place, a name card written in flowing script. McKinney, Coulter, Hensley, Blevins. All 14 men in the search party, plus the names of men who'd disappeared years before. Samuel Greer, Josiah Caudle, Raymond Voss. McKinney picked up one of the cards. It was warm. That's when they heard the footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. Not one set, several, overlapping, too many to count. McKinney drew his revolver and started up the stairs. Frank followed because he was too afraid to be left alone. The second floor had 4 rooms, all empty. Empty of people, at least. But each room contained things that shouldn't exist. A wedding dress on a bed, dated 1873 but clean and white as new snow. A child's school book open to a page of arithmetic, the problems solved in handwriting that matched the place cards downstairs. A mirror on the wall that showed Frank's reflection standing in an empty room, but behind him in the glass, he could see people. Figures in old-fashioned clothes, watching him with expressions of patient hunger. He ran. Down the stairs, out the door, across the clearing. Behind him, he heard McKinney shout his name. Then he heard gunshots, McKinney's revolver firing 6 times. Then silence. Frank ran for 6 hours, crashing through undergrowth, falling down slopes, following the stream because he'd lost the trail. He made it to the property line at dusk, found the tree where they'd left Tom Hensley's hound. The dog was still there, dead, hanging from its lead, its body swollen to twice normal size, its mouth open in a silent howl. He kept running. Jackson didn't know what to do with Frank's testimony. The circuit judge, a man named Walter Sims, read the statement 3 times and ordered it sealed. The official report, filed with the state police, said only that Sheriff McKinney and 13 deputies had disappeared during a search operation in rough terrain. Probable cause unknown. Investigation ongoing. Frank resigned the day after giving his statement. He moved to Lexington, found work in a warehouse, and never spoke about County Fork again except once, when his daughter asked him about the scars on his hands. Thin white lines, dozens of them, like he'd grabbed barbed wire. "Don't go looking for things that don't want to be found," he told her. "Don't ask questions about families that keep their doors shut." The state police sent a team in November. 8 men, well-equipped, with radios and topographic maps. They made it to the stream, crossing, established a base camp, and reported back that they'd found evidence of recent activity. Boot prints, fire pits, possible habitation. Their last radio transmission came through at 6:14 p.m. on November 3rd. Approaching structure now. Door still open. Will report findings. Static after that. The state police tried for 3 days to re-establish contact, then sent a second team up to investigate. The second team found the radio equipment, still functional, sitting in the middle of the base camp. They found sleeping bags laid out in perfect rows. They found cooking gear arranged in patterns that made no tactical sense. What they didn't find were bodies, blood, or any sign of struggle. The second team withdrew, and the state police closed the investigation. Governor's orders, too much publicity, too much panic. The official position became tragic accident, difficult terrain, bodies likely washed away and flash flooding. Families of the missing men received death certificates and small payments from a discretionary fund. Questions were discouraged. Despite official silence, stories spread. They spread the way stories always spread in the mountains, through whispers and warnings, through grandmothers telling grandchildren why they must never go near Caney Fork, through men sharing cigarettes outside churches and admitting quietly that they'd heard things. The children listened, and some children, being children, decided to test the boundaries. In May of 1941, 3 boys from Jackson, Bobby Combs, age 14, Daniel Strong, age 13, and Michael Eversole, age 12, decided to prove they were braver than the adults who'd disappeared. They planned it like a military operation. Canteens, compass, rope, a .22 rifle borrowed from Bobby's father, and a camera loaded with film. They'd hike to the property line, take photographs of the farmhouse from a distance, and come back heroes. They left on a Saturday morning, telling their parents they were fishing at Frozen Creek. They should have been home by dinner. They weren't. Their fathers formed a search party, not to Caney Fork, but along all the normal routes boys might wander. They searched for 3 days, dragged the creek, checked every swimming hole and fishing spot in the county. On the 4th day, the boys walked out of the woods on their own, 3 miles south of Jackson, moving in single file, not speaking. They were unharmed physically, no scratches, no signs of exposure, but they wouldn't talk. They wouldn't make eye contact. They walked straight to their homes, went into their rooms, and stayed there. Bobby Combs's mother tried for days to get him to explain where they'd been. He answered only once. "We saw the house. We didn't go inside. We just looked through the window." They were sitting at the table, all of them, the people from the stories. They turned and looked at us. They smiled. Then the lady at the head of the table stood up and came to the window, and she put her hand on the glass. And Bobby, he stopped, started crying, wouldn't say more. The camera was never found. The rifle came back, though. Bobby's father found it on the front porch a week later, its barrel plugged with honeycomb and bees crawling in and out of the action. All 3 boys survived to adulthood, married, had children of their own. But they never spoke about what they'd seen, and all 3 moved away from Breathitt County as soon as they were old enough to leave. The few friends who asked got the same answer. Some things you see once and spend the rest of your life trying to forget. In 1953, a folklorist from the University of Kentucky named Dr. Ellen Marsh became interested in the Whitaker case. She'd been collecting oral histories across Appalachia, documenting stories that straddled the line between legend and history, and the Caney Fork disappearances fit perfectly into her research on isolation and community mythology. Dr. Marsh spent 6 months in Jackson, interviewing anyone who talked to her. She collected testimony, reviewed newspaper archives, mapped out disappearances, and developed a theory she published in an academic journal under the title The Whittaker Phenomenon: Communal Fear and the Construction of Liminal Space in Eastern Kentucky. Her argument, stripped of academic jargon, was this: the Whittakers had likely died of disease or violence sometime between 1912 and 1915. The subsequent disappearances were unrelated tragedies, people getting lost in difficult terrain, succumbing to exposure, falling into abandoned mine shafts, or fleeing the county for reasons they kept private. The community, traumatized by poverty and isolation, had woven these separate incidents into a single narrative to give meaning to senseless loss. The haunted hollow became a collective coping mechanism, a way to externalize fear and maintain social cohesion through shared mythology. It was a reasonable theory, well-researched, logically sound. Dr. Marsh submitted her paper, received positive reviews, and decided to strengthen her argument with one final piece of evidence: photographs of the abandoned Whittaker property showing natural decay consistent with 40 years of exposure. She hired a local guide, a man named Ray Combs, who claimed to know the area, and on October 12, 1953, they hiked into Caney Fork with cameras and surveying equipment. Ray turned back at the property line. He refused to go further, even when Dr. Marsh offered to double his fee. She accused him of perpetuating superstition, of betraying the rationalist principles she'd assumed any guide would share. He said, "You can believe what you want, lady. I'm going home." Dr. Marsh continued alone. She was 46 years old, in good health, experienced in backcountry hiking, and utterly convinced that fear was the only real danger. She left Ray at 9 a.m. with instructions to wait until 4 p.m., then hike out and alert authorities if she hadn't returned. She returned at 2:30, walking fast, her equipment abandoned, her notebook torn to pieces and scattered behind her like confetti. Ray tried to ask what happened. She wouldn't answer, just kept walking, kept looking over her shoulder. They made it back to Jackson by nightfall. Dr. Marsh checked into the Jackson Hotel, locked her door, and wrote a single-page addendum to her published paper. She mailed it to the journal editor with a note: "Publish this or don't. I will not discuss it further. I'm leaving Kentucky tonight and never coming back." The addendum read, in its entirety, "I was wrong. The house is not abandoned. The family is still there. They are not human. They have never been human. And they are waiting." The journal declined to publish the addendum. By the 1960s, everyone in Breathitt County knew the rules. Don't go near Caney Fork. Don't hike the ridges above the hollow. Don't ask questions about the Whittakers. And if you hear laughter in the woods at dusk, turn around and walk the other way. But knowing the rules and enforcing them are different things, and Jackson had a problem. The county needed that land. Coal companies had given up after losing surveying teams, but by 1965, the federal government started eyeing Breathitt County for a reservoir project. The Army Corps of Engineers wanted to dam Troublesome Creek, flood the valley, and create a water supply for the growing cities downstate. Caney Fork Hollow fell squarely in the flood zone. The Corps sent engineers to survey, and the engineers needed access. They filed for federal eminent domain, which meant they didn't need permission. They could seize the property, compensate theoretical heirs, and proceed with construction. The law was clear. The Corps had authority, and Jackson had a choice. Let the engineers go up and face whatever was waiting, or tell the truth about why no one went there. Telling the truth meant admitting decades of disappearances, admitting that local law enforcement had covered up unsolved cases, admitting that the county had essentially ceded territory to something it couldn't name or control. It meant national attention, investigations, journalists swarming the hills, and the kind of scrutiny that would destroy property values and reputations across the region. The county commissioners met in closed session. They voted 4-1 to say nothing. The Corps of Engineers sent a survey team on June 9, 1965. 6 men with transits and chain measures, accompanied by a federal marshal named Thomas Wickham, who had authority to remove squatters if necessary. They flew into Jackson by helicopter, offloaded equipment, and started hiking at dawn. By noon, Jackson residents who lived on the north side of town reported hearing something from the direction of County Fork. Not screams exactly, more like a sound that made their teeth ache. A vibration, felt more than heard, like distant thunder that never resolved into actual thunder. The helicopter returned at 4 p.m. to pick up the survey team. They weren't at the rendezvous point. The pilot waited until dark, radioed for instructions, and flew back to Lexington alone. The Corps sent a second team, then a third. Both withdrew before reaching the property, citing unsafe conditions, in reports so vague they read like templates. After the third withdrawal, the Corps quietly moved the reservoir project 20 miles south, flooding different land, inconveniencing different families. No official reason given, no press conference, just a quiet notation in a federal file that Caney Fork Hollow was unsuitable for development, and Jackson collectively breathed easier. What would you do if you were on that county commission? If you knew sending those engineers up meant sending them to die, but saying nothing meant saving your town from scrutiny it couldn't survive? If the choice was between distant strangers and your own children, your own neighbors, your own land, the commissioners chose silence, the way people in Jackson had been choosing silence since 1912. And Marshal Wickham, the federal officer who disappeared with that last survey team, had a wife in Virginia who spent 30 years writing letters demanding investigation. She never got answers. The file was classified. The case was closed. And the commissioners who'd voted to say nothing went to their graves without ever admitting what they'd done. Complicity, sometimes, wears the face of self-preservation. On September 14, 1978, a wildfire started in Breathitt County during the driest summer anyone could remember. Lightning hit a dead oak on Bull Ridge, and within hours, flames were racing through the understory, consuming laurel and pine, jumping creeks, driven by winds that seemed to blow from every direction at once. The fire reached Caney Fork Hollow at midnight. Residents of Jackson watched from their porches as the orange glow lit up the northern sky. They watched smoke boil into columns that twisted like living things. They listened to the forest roar with heat that you could feel miles away, heat that cracked rocks and turned streams to steam. And they waited to see what would happen when fire reached the Whitaker property. The fire burned everything around it. It consumed timber. It blackened stone. It reduced a century of growth to ash in a single night. But when dawn came, the Whitaker farmhouse still stood, not untouched, scorched, blackened, parts of the roof fully collapsed, but standing, an island of structure in an ocean of char. Fire crews hiked in to investigate. They found the burn pattern impossible. Flames had come within 10 feet of the house on all sides, then stopped, as if hitting an invisible barrier. The ground around the structure was green, vegetation intact, while everything beyond was devastated. The crew chief, a man named Larry Henderson from the State Forestry Service, took photographs and soil samples. He filed a report that called it anomalous fire behavior, possible underground moisture source, and recommended further study. That study never happened, because 3 days after the fire, The house burned from the inside. No lightning this time, no obvious ignition source. Witnesses in Jackson reported seeing light in the windows. Not firelight, something steadier, brighter. And then, at precisely 3 a.m. on September 17th, the structure exploded. Not collapsed, exploded, timbers blown outward in a perfect circle, the blast loud enough to rattle windows 7 miles away. When investigators reached the site, they found the farmhouse reduced to a crater 12 feet deep and 30 feet across. The logs had been pulverized into splinters, the stone foundation had melted into glass, and in the center of the crater, they found bones. Hundreds of bones. Not just human, though there were human remains, too many to count, but animal bones, bird bones, bones from creatures the state archaeologist couldn't identify. They were arranged in patterns, spirals, concentric circles, shapes that looked like writing in an alphabet no one recognized. The bones were old. Carbon dating suggested some were 200 years old, but they'd been placed recently. The soil around them had been disturbed within the last decade. The state police quarantined the site. They brought in forensic teams, anthropologists, archaeologists. They spent 3 months excavating, cataloging, trying to make sense of what they'd found. They identified partial remains from at least 40 individuals, including matches to DNA from descendants of Samuel Greer, Josiah Caudle, and Sheriff James McKinney. They found no evidence of who had arranged the bones, no explanation for the explosion, no answers to the questions everyone was asking. The official report, released in May of 1979, concluded that the Whitaker property had been used as an illegal burial site by parties unknown, and that the fire and subsequent explosion had exposed remains from multiple time periods, possibly spanning several decades. It was technically true and completely inadequate. Frank Coulter died in Lexington on January 3, 1982, at the age of 70. His daughter found a letter in his desk, sealed and addressed to whoever finds this. She opened it, read it once, and brought it to a lawyer who specialized in estate matters. The lawyer advised her to burn it. She didn't. The letter, now housed in the University of Kentucky archives under restricted access, contains Frank's final testimony about October 7, 1937. It's longer and more detailed than his original statement, written with the clarity of a man who knows he's dying and wants the truth preserved, even if no one believes it. The relevant passage. When I ran from that house, I thought I was alone, but I wasn't. Something followed me down the mountain, not chasing, following at a distance, patient. I could hear it moving through the trees, always parallel, always just out of sight. It followed me all the way to the property line, and when I crossed, it stopped. I looked back. Standing at the tree line was a woman, tall, wearing a dress from the last century, her hair long and dark. She was too far away to see her face clearly, but I felt her watching me. She raised one hand, not waving, just acknowledging. And then she smiled. I recognized that smile. I'd seen it before, in the mirror upstairs. It was my smile, on her face, like she'd taken it and was showing it back to me. Sheriff McKinney didn't make it out because he tried to fight. He shot at things that couldn't be shot. But I ran, and they let me go. And I've spent 40 years trying to understand why. I think they let me go so I could tell the story. So people would know they're still there, still waiting. The Whitakers, or whatever is using that name, they feed on curiosity, on people who can't let mysteries alone, on men like McKinney who think investigation can solve anything. They wanted witnesses. They wanted people to come looking. And they wanted at least one person to come back and spread the word. so others would follow. I've been their accomplice for 40 years. Every time someone asked me what happened and I said I couldn't talk about it, I made them more curious. Every time I refused to explain, I made the mystery deeper. I did exactly what they wanted. Don't go to Caney Fork. Don't go looking for the Whitakers. But I know you will. Somebody always does. And when you do, remember. They've been waiting since before this county had a name. They've been collecting people for longer than anyone alive can remember. And they're patient. They have nothing but time. The Whitaker property remains undeveloped. The crater from the 1978 fire has filled with vegetation, briars and sumac at first, then pine saplings, now nearly full-grown trees. The state owns the land, purchased through tax foreclosure in 1985, but no one has ever built anything there. Proposals surface occasionally. A cell tower, a fire lookout, a trailhead for hikers, and each proposal dies in committee without explanation. Locals still avoid the hollow. The old logging road has grown over completely. No hunters track deer through those hills. No ginseng diggers brave the ridges. And on still nights, when fog settles thick between the mountains, people in Jackson close their windows and turn up their radios, because sometimes, carried on the wind from the north, you can still hear laughter. High and strange, childlike but not children. Always at dusk, when the light fails and the world turns uncertain. In 2015, a documentary crew from Louisville got permits to film in Breathitt County, working on a series about Appalachian folklore. They interviewed descendants of the families who'd lost people to Caney Fork. They reviewed archives, studied maps, hired a guide, and on October 6th, 78 years to the day after Sheriff McKinney's party disappeared, they hiked in with cameras and sound equipment. The guide turned back at the property line. He knew the stories. He'd been raised on them. But the crew pressed forward, laughing at superstition, certain that documentation would dispel mystery the way light dispels shadow. Their footage was found 3 days later, cameras intact, batteries dead. Most of it was standard documentary material, interviews, scenery, the crater site. But the last 7 minutes showed something else. The crew approaching a structure that shouldn't exist. A farmhouse intact, smoke rising from the chimney. A door opening. Figures in old-fashioned clothing, standing in the doorway, beckoning. The crew walking forward, the camera dropping. And then laughter, high and strange, filling the audio track until the recording stopped. They say the Whitakers haven't left their hills since 1912, but that's not quite right. They never needed to leave, because curious people keep coming to them, drawn by mystery like moths to flame, feeding something that's been hungry for longer than memory and patient as stone. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.